I sat in that lawyer's office, quiet as stone, while my late wife's family divided up what they thought was theirs. Her brother leaned back with that smug smile and said, "At least you had the house while it lasted," like I was some charity case they'd tolerated for 40 years. They believed I was walking out with nothing, and I didn't correct them because my wife had made me promise something months before she passed. Something I didn't fully understand until that moment. The lawyer's hand moved slowly across the final page, and I watched their faces, still confident, still certain this was their victory in a story about family betrayal they'd written without me. I waited, because sometimes the loudest revenge stories are told in complete silence. If you've ever been quietly erased from a story you helped build, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not the kind of pain that comes with shouting or broken dishes. It's the slow, cold realization that people you spent decades caring for have already written you out of the narrative. They don't see the sacrifices, the late nights, the moments you held everything together while they lived their lives. They just see someone they can overlook, someone whose presence became so familiar it turned invisible. This isn't just my story. It's the story of anyone who's ever been treated like furniture in their own home. Subscribe to the channel by the button below and stay with me, because what happened in that law office wasn't just about money or property, but about being seen after years of being seen through a glass. They thought the story was over the moment they lowered her casket into the ground, already dividing up the life we built together in their minds. I could see it in their eyes at the funeral, that mix of pity and smugness, like they were doing me a favor by letting me attend. But here's what they didn't know. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is quiet for a reason, and it's not because they have nothing to say. My wife had asked me to trust her, to stay silent no matter what they said about family betrayal. And I'd made her a promise. But before I tell you what happened when that lawyer opened the final page, we need to go back a few years so you understand exactly how we got to this point. My name is Oswald, and I'm 68 years old now, living in a quiet suburb outside Pittsburgh where the houses all look the same and neighbors wave but don't really know each other. I've been the kind of man people forget is in the room, not because I'm weak or invisible by nature, but because I learned early in my marriage that sometimes keeping the peace means keeping your mouth shut. For 40 years, I stood beside my wife Margaret, through everything, the good seasons and the storms that nearly broke us, building a life in that 3-bedroom house that her family would later pretend I had nothing to do with. I worked at the same manufacturing plant for 32 years, third shift mostly, because it paid 17% more and we needed every dollar when we were starting out. Margaret's family never understood why I didn't chase promotions or look for something more prestigious. But they weren't the ones lying awake at 3 in the morning wondering how to pay for her mother's medication or fix the furnace that died every January. I gave up a job offer in Denver back in 1989, a position that would have doubled my salary, because moving meant leaving her family behind, and Margaret couldn't bear that distance. So I stayed, became the steady foundation everyone built their lives on top of, and watched opportunities pass by like trains I was never meant to catch. Margaret's family, the Hendersons, never really accepted me the way a family should. Her brother Richard owned a car dealership in the nice part of town, drove a Cadillac, and never let anyone forget he'd made something of himself. Her sister Patricia married a doctor and lived in one of those gated communities where even the mailboxes look expensive. Then there was me, Oswald the factory worker, the guy who showed up to Thanksgiving dinner at Patricia's house every year and sat at the far end of the table while they talked about investments and vacation homes in Hilton Head. They never asked about my day, my thoughts, or the dreams I'd folded up and put away to make room for everyone else's needs, because in their eyes, people like me didn't have dreams worth discussing. I sustained that household through periods that would have destroyed most marriages, and I've got the scars to prove it, even if nobody bothered to notice them. When Margaret's father Harold got diagnosed with lung cancer in 2003, I was the one driving him to chemotherapy appointments at St. Francis Hospital every Tuesday and Thursday for 8 months, while Richard was too busy with inventory, and Patricia couldn't handle seeing her father that way. When the economy crashed in 2008 and Margaret lost her job at the insurance company, I picked up double shifts, worked 70-hour weeks until my hands shook from exhaustion, and never once complained because that's what you do when you love someone. But the thanks I got was being treated like hired help at my own family gatherings. The invisible man who paid for things and fixed things and disappeared when the real family wanted to talk about matters that actually mattered. Some people don't disappear. They're simply edited out of the story until they're barely a footnote in someone else's chapter. That's what happened to me over 4 decades in that house on Maple Street. A slow fade from husband and partner to just some guy who happened to live there and keep the lights on. I watched it happen in real time at every birthday party, every Christmas dinner, every summer barbecue where Richard would slap my shoulder and make jokes about blue-collar wisdom while everyone laughed. My opinions didn't matter, my presence didn't register. And after a while, I think even Margaret's family forgot I had a voice at all, forgot that I was a man with thoughts and feelings and a breaking point they kept pushing closer to without ever realizing the danger. They got so comfortable with my silence that they mistook it for acceptance, for agreement, for proof that I knew my place in their hierarchy, and that mistake would cost them everything. Margaret started getting sick in the spring of 2022, nothing dramatic at first, just a tiredness that wouldn't go away no matter how much she slept. We were sitting on the back porch one April evening, watching the sun drop behind the Johnsons' fence, when she told me she'd been to see Dr. Morrison and the tests didn't look good. Stage 3, they called it, and the words hung in the air between us like smoke we couldn't wave away. I reached for her hand and she squeezed back, but there was something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of determination that made me think she'd already started planning for a future I couldn't see yet. That's when things started changing between us, not in a bad way, but in a way that felt like she was preparing me for something I wasn't ready to understand. The treatment started in May at Allegheny General, and I drove her to every single appointment, sat in those sterile waiting rooms reading magazines I didn't care about while poison dripped into her veins, trying to kill the thing that was killing her. Her family showed up for the first few visits, made a big production of their concern, but by June they'd all found reasons why they couldn't make it anymore. Richard had inventory issues, Patricia had a cruise booked, and suddenly I was the only one sitting beside Margaret's hospital bed at 2 a.m. when the pain got so bad she couldn't sleep. I didn't mind. I'd spent 40 years being the one who showed up, but I noticed Margaret was noticing too, watching her family's absence with eyes that saw everything and said nothing. It was during one of those late nights in July, around 3 a.m. when the hospital hallways go quiet and you can hear every machine beeping in the distance, that Margaret asked me something strange. We were alone in her room, the TV playing some old western neither of us was watching. And she turned to me with that look she got when she'd made up her mind about something important. "Oswald," she said, her voice weak but clear. "I need you to promise me something, and I need you to trust me even if you don't understand why." I told her I'd promise her anything, which was true then, and would have been true every day of our marriage. "When I'm gone, no matter what my family says, no matter how they treat you, or what they claim is theirs, I need you to stay quiet and let things play out exactly as I've arranged them." I didn't understand what she meant, and when I asked her to explain, she just shook her head and squeezed my hand tighter. She told me there were things she'd put in place, conversations she'd had with our lawyer Thomas Brennan, arrangements that would make sense when the time came but couldn't be discussed now. "They're going to say things that will hurt," she warned me, her eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made my chest ache. "They're going to treat you like you don't matter, like these 40 years meant nothing, and I need you to let them." I sat there confused, wanting to argue, wanting to tell her I'd defend myself and our marriage against whatever family betrayal she was worried about. But she made me swear on everything we'd built together that I'd stay silent, that I'd trust her plan even when it felt like the whole world was against me. The next few months were the hardest of my life, watching the woman I loved fade a little more each day while carrying this secret promise I didn't fully comprehend. Margaret had always been smarter than people gave her credit for, quieter than her loud family but sharper, seeing angles and understanding people in ways that took me years to appreciate. She'd grown up watching her family operate, seen how they valued money over loyalty and status over character, And somewhere in those final months, she'd decided to teach them a lesson I wouldn't understand until I was sitting in that lawyer's office. She never told me the details, just kept reminding me to trust her, to remember my promise, to know that silence sometimes carries more power than any words I could speak. And so I promised, over and over, even as I felt the weight of something enormous settling onto my shoulders. Something that wouldn't make sense until the day they buried her and her family started circling like vultures around everything we'd built. Margaret passed away on a cold Tuesday morning in October, just as the leaves on Maple Street were turning that deep red she always loved. I was holding her hand when she took her last breath, and in that moment, the world went silent in a way I'd never experienced before, like someone had turned off all the sound except for the monitor flatline that told me she was gone. Her family showed up an hour later, dry-eyed and already talking about funeral arrangements in voices that sounded more annoyed than sad, like her dying had interrupted their schedules. Richard immediately started making calls about the service. Patricia began sorting through Margaret's jewelry right there in the hospital room, and I just sat there watching them turn my wife's death into a business transaction before her body was even cold. The funeral at St. Michael's Church 3 days later was one of the most painful experiences of my life, and not just because I was burying my wife of 40 years. I stood at the front greeting people who'd known us both, accepting condolences from neighbors and old friends, while Margaret's family huddled in the corner, having whispered conversations that stopped the moment I got close. During the reception at Patricia's house afterward, I overheard Richard telling someone, "At least the family will keep what's rightfully ours. He never really contributed much anyway." I was standing 10 feet away holding a plate of food I couldn't eat, and he knew I could hear him. That was the whole point. They wanted me to know exactly where I stood, now that Margaret wasn't there to pretend I mattered. The comments kept coming over the next few days, little poisoned arrows disguised as concern. Patricia called to tell me I shouldn't worry about finding a new place too quickly, that they understood these things take time, as if the house I'd been paying the mortgage on for 37 years was somehow hers to grant me time in. Richard stopped by with papers for me to sign, documents he claimed were just formalities but kept pushing across my kitchen table with that smile that didn't reach his eyes. Margaret's cousin Helen, who I'd helped move furniture twice and loaned money to in 2015 that she never paid back, actually patted my arm and said, "You'll be okay, Oswald. You don't need much at your age." The disrespect was so casual, so confident, like they'd already erased me from the family story and were just waiting for me to accept my exit. I sat through every comment, every dismissive look, every conversation that happened around me like I wasn't even there. At the post-funeral dinner, they divided up Margaret's belongings right in front of me, Patricia claiming the china set we'd received as a wedding gift, Richard taking the antique clock that had sat on our mantel for decades. Nobody asked what I wanted. Nobody considered that these items held memories for me too. They just took and took while I sat in the corner of what used to be my wife's favorite restaurant, watching family betrayal happen in real time over chicken parmesan and house wine. I didn't react, didn't correct them, didn't defend myself, or the 40 years I'd spent building a life they were now pretending I'd just observed from the sidelines. They weren't waiting for answers or trying to understand what Margaret had wanted. They were waiting for me to shrink, to disappear completely now that the woman who'd made me tolerable to them was gone. I could see it in how they looked at me, that mixture of pity and contempt, like I was some stray dog Margaret had kept around out of kindness and now they had to figure out what to do with me. Richard made jokes about starting fresh, and Patricia kept mentioning retirement communities in conversations clearly meant for me to overhear, painting a future where I faded away quietly while they enjoyed the fruits of a marriage they'd never respected. But I remembered my promise to Margaret, those late-night conversations in the hospital when she'd made me swear to stay silent no matter what they said. So I sat there, took every insult, absorbed every dismissal, and waited for the day Thomas Brennan would call us all together to read the will, trusting in something I couldn't see but knew was coming. Thomas Brennan called me 2 weeks after the funeral and asked if I could come to his office on Hamilton Street the following Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. His voice on the phone was professional but careful, like he was carrying something heavy he couldn't talk about yet, and he made sure to tell me that Margaret's family had already been notified and would be attending. I hung up, feeling that weight in my chest again. That promise I'd made to stay silent pressing down harder now that the moment was actually coming. I didn't sleep much the night before. Kept thinking about Margaret's words in that hospital room. About trusting her even when it felt like the whole world was against me. Thursday morning I put on my good suit. The navy one I'd worn to our daughter's wedding back when life still made sense, and drove downtown wondering what exactly I was walking into. The law office was one of those old buildings with dark wood paneling and leather chairs that creaked when you sat down. The kind of place that smelled like old books and important decisions. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the waiting room watching Richard and Patricia come in together, both dressed like they were attending a business meeting instead of the reading of their sister's will. Richard nodded at me with that same condescending smile. Patricia didn't acknowledge me at all, and they took seats on the opposite side of the room like I was contagious. Margaret's cousin Helen showed up with her husband Frank, and her brother's wife Diane came alone because Richard's son was apparently too busy to attend the distribution of his aunt's estate. They all settled in with this air of confidence, this certainty that they knew exactly how this was going to go, and I could hear them whispering about how quickly they could get things sorted and move on with their lives. Thomas Brennan's secretary called us in at exactly 2 o'clock, and we filed into his conference room like students taking seats for an exam nobody had studied for. The room had a long mahogany table with chairs arranged on both sides, and Thomas sat at the head with a thick folder in front of him and reading glasses perched on his nose. He greeted everyone formally, offered condolences that sounded genuine when he looked at me and rehearsed when he looked at the others, then asked us all to please hold our questions until he'd finished reading through the documents. Richard leaned back in his chair, looking relaxed. Patricia was already making notes on a legal pad she'd brought, and I sat there with my hands folded on the table, feeling like I was about to watch something I'd been preparing for without knowing what the preparation was even for. Thomas began reading in that steady lawyer voice that turns human wishes into legal language, starting with the standard opening about Margaret being of sound mind and body when she'd drafted this document back in March of 2022. He went through the first section distributing smaller items, personal effects that Margaret had designated for specific people. Her mother's wedding ring to Patricia, a collection of first edition books to Richard, some jewelry pieces to Helen and Diane. Each person nodded as their name was called, satisfied smiles spreading across faces as they mentally calculated values and congratulated themselves on their inheritance. I noticed Thomas glancing at me between sections, something in his expression that might have been sympathy or might have been anticipation. I couldn't tell which. The room felt warm, stuffy, and I could hear Patricia's pen scratching across her notepad, keeping inventory of family betrayal disguised as proper estate distribution. Then Thomas moved to the financial assets, reading through bank accounts and investment portfolios that Margaret had maintained, distributing modest amounts to various family members in ways that seemed fair and measured. Richard received some stocks. Patricia got a savings account that had belonged to their mother. Cousins and in-laws received checks in amounts that made them nod approvingly. The whole thing felt choreographed, expected, exactly what everyone in that room had assumed would happen, and I could feel them relaxing into their chairs, confident now that this was just a formality before they could leave and celebrate their good fortune. But then Thomas paused, his hand resting on the last few pages of the document, and the air in that conference room changed in a way I felt in my bones before I understood why. He looked up at the family, then at me, and said in a voice that carried weight I'd been waiting months to hear, "There is one final addendum that Mrs. Henderson added to this will. A section she specifically requested be read last and in its entirety before any questions are addressed." Thomas turned the page slowly, deliberately, like he was handling something fragile that could shatter if moved too quickly. The sound of that paper sliding across the others was the loudest thing in the room, louder than Patricia's breathing, louder than the traffic outside on Hamilton Street, louder than my own heartbeat hammering in my chest. Richard shifted in his chair, still relaxed, still wearing that smile that said he'd already won a game nobody else knew they were playing. Patricia glanced at her notepad one more time, adding up numbers in her head, and Helen whispered something to Frank that made him nod. They had no idea what was coming, No sense that the ground beneath their confidence was about to open up and swallow everything they'd assumed was theirs. I sat completely still, my hands still folded on that mahogany table, watching Thomas's face as he read ahead silently before speaking the words out loud. This was the moment Margaret had prepared me for. The reason she'd made me promise to stay quiet through every insult, every dismissal, every casual cruelty her family had thrown my way since she'd passed. I could see her in my mind, lying in that hospital bed at 3 a.m, her hand squeezing mine as she told me to trust her even when it hurt. She'd known exactly what her family would do, had watched them her whole life measuring worth in dollars and treating kindness like weakness. And somewhere in those final months, she'd decided enough was enough. The weight I'd been carrying since that conversation finally started to make sense, like pieces of a puzzle I'd been holding without seeing the picture they formed. My mind flashed back to one specific night in August, about 6 weeks before she died, when Margaret had been strong enough to sit up in bed and talk without the pain medication making her words fuzzy. She'd looked at me with those eyes that had seen 40 years of my life and said something I hadn't understood then, but was starting to understand now. "Oswaldy, they think silence means acceptance, that quiet people don't notice or don't care when they're being erased," she'd told me, her voice weak but her meaning sharp as glass. "But you and I know better. We know that sometimes the quietest people are the ones paying the most attention, seeing everything, remembering everything, and waiting for exactly the right moment to show what they've learned." I'd kissed her forehead and told her to rest, not realizing she was explaining the gift she was about to give me, the kind of love that protects even after death. Thomas cleared his throat, and the sound brought me back to that conference room where Margaret's family sat congratulating themselves on inheritance they hadn't earned from a woman they'd barely visited in her final months. Richard's smile was still there. Patricia's pen was still poised over her notepad, and nobody seemed to notice the shift in Thomas's expression, the way his jaw had set in that particular way lawyers get when they're about to deliver news that changes everything. The afternoon sun coming through the window behind him cast shadows across the table, and I noticed dust particles floating in the light, suspended and weightless, like time itself had slowed down to let this moment breathe. This was it, the culmination of Margaret's plan, the reason she'd made me swear to endure their disrespect without fighting back. And I felt something rising in my chest that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite vindication, but somewhere perfectly between the two. Outside I could hear a siren in the distance. Someone's emergency happening in a city that kept moving while our small drama played out in this wood-paneled room. But in here, everything had gone still, suspended in that moment before truth rewrites history and shows people who they really are when the masks come off. Thomas looked at me one more time, and I gave him the smallest nod. Permission to continue. Permission to honor my wife's final wishes and deliver the message she'd been too kind to deliver while she was alive. Margaret had loved her family despite everything, had protected them from themselves for decades, but in the end she'd loved me more, loved justice more, and had decided that some lessons can only be taught after you're gone. Thomas's eyes moved back to the document, his finger tracing the words Margaret had written months ago, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a woman who'd spent her last days making sure the truth would be heard even when she couldn't speak it herself. Thomas's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk, reading words that Margaret had written specifically for this moment. "To my husband Oswald, who has carried more weight than any man should have to bear, who has been dismissed, overlooked, and erased by people who should have honored him, I leave the following with full legal authority and irrevocable instruction." The room shifted. You could feel it physically, like air pressure dropping before a storm, and Richard's smile finally started to crack at the edges. Thomas continued, his voice steady and professional, explaining that what everyone had just heard was preliminary distribution, small gestures Margaret had made to keep appearances, but that the real substance of her estate had been protected in a confidential addendum drafted 6 months before her death. Patricia's pen stopped moving. Helen sat up straighter, and I watched understanding start to dawn on faces that had been so certain just moments before. Thomas pulled out a second document, this one sealed and notarized, explaining that Margaret had established an irrevocable trust in March of 2022, the same month she'd received her diagnosis. Everything of actual value. The house on Maple Street that we'd paid off together. The life insurance policy worth $370,000. The investment accounts she'd quietly built over decades. The rental property in Shadyside that her family didn't even know existed. All of it had been placed in a trust with one sole beneficiary and trustee, Mrs. Henderson was very clear in her instructions, Thomas said, looking directly at Richard and Patricia now. She wanted to ensure that the person who had actually built this life with her, who had sacrificed and supported and remained faithful through 40 years, would be protected from any contest or claim. The words hung in the air like smoke, and I watched Richard's face go from confident to confused, to something approaching panic, as the mathematics of his assumed inheritance collapsed in real time. But Margaret hadn't stopped there. And this is where I finally understood the full scope of what my wife had done in those final months. Thomas explained that the trust included specific language about family betrayal, documented instances over the years where her family had dismissed me, used me, or treated our marriage as less than legitimate. She'd kept records, actual written records of conversations and incidents going back years, times when Richard had borrowed money and never paid it back, when Patricia had asked me to co-sign loans and then bad-mouthed me at family gatherings, when her entire family had treated me like furniture while benefiting from my labor and my paycheck. Your wife wanted it clearly understood, Thomas said, his voice carrying an edge now, that this wasn't a decision made in anger or illness, but a correction of an injustice that had been building for decades. One she had tolerated out of love for family, but would not allow to continue after her death. The control I now held wasn't just financial. It was complete and legally unbreakable. Margaret had given me sole authority over everything, including assets her family had assumed were theirs by blood right, properties they'd already mentally divided, accounts they'd been counting on to fund their comfortable retirements. Thomas read through the specifics, each line landing like a hammer, explaining that I had full discretion over the estate, that no contest could be filed because Margaret had included a poison pill clause. Anyone who challenged the trust would forfeit even the small bequests they'd already received. Richard tried to interrupt, his voice cracking as he started to say something about family and fairness. But Thomas held up his hand and continued reading. To my siblings, I leave the knowledge that blood does not entitle you to what love and partnership built. And to my husband, I leave everything, trusting that he will use it with the wisdom and kindness you never showed him. The final paragraph was Margaret speaking directly to me, and Thomas's voice softened as he read her words. Oswald, by the time you hear this, they will have shown you exactly who they are. They will have proven every concern I had about how they would treat you once I was gone. And I need you to know that I saw it coming because I've watched them my whole life. My eyes burned, but I didn't let tears fall. Not here. Not in front of people who'd spent weeks trying to erase me from a story I'd written with my own hands. Joe, you kept your promise to stay silent. And now I'm keeping mine to protect you. Use what I've left you to build whatever life brings you peace. And know that the greatest revenge isn't in taking from them. It's in showing them that the person they dismissed was worth more than all of them combined. Thomas closed the folder, removed his glasses, and looked around the table at faces that had gone pale with shock and the dawning realization that everything they'd assumed, everything they'd planned, every dismissive comment and casual cruelty had been witnessed, documented, and answered with the kind of justice that doesn't shout, but simply stands up and takes back what was always rightfully mine. The silence that followed Thomas's final words was the kind you feel in your bones, heavy and absolute, like the air had been sucked out of the room and nobody knew how to breathe it back in. Richard was the first to try speaking, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water, finally managing to stammer something about this not being what Margaret really wanted, that she must have been confused or influenced or not thinking clearly. Thomas didn't even look up from organizing his papers when he responded, his voice flat and factual, explaining that Margaret had been evaluated by 2 independent physicians who'd certified her mental competency specifically for this document, that every word had been her choice, reviewed multiple times over several months. Patricia tried next, her voice shaking with something between anger and desperation, demanding to know when this trust had been created, why they hadn't been informed, insisting there must be legal grounds to challenge such an obvious case of undue influence. Thomas finally looked up at her with the kind of patience you show a child who doesn't understand why they can't have candy for dinner. He explained slowly, carefully, that undue influence requires proof that someone coerced or manipulated the deceased, and that Margaret's documentation actually proved the opposite, showed a clear pattern of her family's behavior that justified her decisions. He slid a folder across the table, a copy of the evidence Margaret had compiled, dates and details of every loan never repaid, every promise broken, every time they'd used me or dismissed me or treated our marriage like an inconvenience they had to tolerate. Richard reached for it, but didn't open it, like he already knew what was inside and couldn't bear to see his own actions written down in black and white. Helen started crying quietly, not from grief, but from the realization that the comfortable retirement she'd been planning on her cousin's money had just evaporated, and Frank put his arm around her in a gesture that looked more like restraint than comfort. The attempts to argue continued for another few minutes, each one weaker than the last. Voices that had been so confident 2 hours ago now reduced to desperate bargaining and thin justifications. Patricia suggested family mediation. Richard mentioned getting his own lawyer. Diane brought up Margaret's love of family as if that somehow negated 40 years of watching them treat me like I didn't exist. But Thomas had an answer for everything because Margaret had thought of everything, had spent her final months building a legal structure so airtight that even the best attorneys in Pittsburgh couldn't find a crack to exploit. The poison pill clause meant that any challenge would cost them even the small amounts they'd already received, and the trust structure meant I had complete discretion. I could choose to be generous, or I could choose to honor Margaret's clear wishes by giving them exactly what they'd given me over 4 decades, which was nothing that mattered. I finally spoke then, the first words I'd said since entering that conference room, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "She didn't take anything from you," I said, looking at each of them in turn, watching them squirm under a gaze they'd never bothered to meet before. "She simply stopped protecting you from the consequences of how you chose to treat people." Richard started to respond, but I held up my hand, the same way Thomas had earlier. And the fact that he actually stopped talking told me everything about how power had shifted in that room. I explained that for 40 years I'd watched them take and take, had stayed quiet because Margaret asked me to, had absorbed their disrespect because keeping peace mattered more than defending myself. But she saw everything. I continued, my voice carrying weight. It had never been allowed to carry in their presence. "She watched you use me, dismiss me, erase me from a family I'd supported and sustained, and she decided that silence had protected you long enough." The meeting ended, not with shouting or dramatic exits, but with a kind of defeated shuffling. People gathering coats and bags with hands that shook slightly, avoiding eye contact with each other and especially with me. Patricia tried one last appeal at the door, her voice small now, asking if we could talk privately about what Margaret would have really wanted, as if 4 decades of evidence could be overwritten by a 5-minute conversation in a hallway. I looked at her the way you look at a stranger asking for directions to somewhere you've never been, polite but distant, and told her that Margaret had been very clear about what she wanted, had put it in writing with lawyers and witnesses and legal language, specifically because she knew her family would try to rewrite history the moment she couldn't defend it anymore. They left Thomas's office one by one, their confident entrance reversed into a humiliated exit, and I stayed behind with Thomas to sign papers that made official what Margaret had already decided. That the man they'd spent 40 years overlooking would be the one standing when the dust settled, not because I'd fought for it, but because my wife had fought for me when I'd promised not to fight for myself. I drove home that afternoon in a daze, the late October sun casting long shadows across Maple Street as I pulled into the driveway of the house that was now undeniably, legally, completely mine. Everything looked the same mailbox I'd replaced 3 times over the years, the same front porch where Margaret and I had sat on summer evenings, the same oak tree we'd planted when we first moved in that was now taller than the roof. But something fundamental had shifted, not in the physical world but in the invisible architecture of respect and recognition, in the understanding of who had built what and who deserved to stand in the structure when everything else fell away. I sat in my truck for a long moment, keys still in the ignition, letting the reality of what had just happened settle into my bones like warmth after years of cold. The truth Margaret had protected me with wasn't just about money or property. It was about being seen after 40 years of invisibility, about having your worth acknowledged by the one person whose opinion actually mattered. She'd watched her family treat me like I was disposable, had heard every dismissive comment and seen every disrespectful gesture, and instead of asking me to fight battles that would have torn our marriage apart, she'd planned something bigger. She'd documented everything, built a legal fortress around the life we'd created together, and waited until she couldn't be argued with or guilted or manipulated into changing her mind. The family betrayal she'd witnessed wasn't something that happened suddenly. It was a slow accumulation of small cruelties over decades, and she'd decided that the only way to address it was to let them reveal themselves completely before showing them the mirror of consequences. I understood now why she'd made me promise to stay silent, why she'd needed me to endure their disrespect without defending myself in those weeks after her funeral. If I'd fought back, if I'd argued or corrected or tried to claim what was mine, they could have painted me as aggressive, grasping, someone trying to steal from a grieving family. But by staying quiet, by letting them hang themselves with their own words and assumptions, I'd given them enough rope to build the gallows Margaret had designed. Every dismissive comment, every assumption that I'd be left with nothing, every confident claim about what was rightfully theirs, it had all been recorded in their behavior, if not their words, proving exactly why Margaret had made the decisions she'd made. The silence she'd asked me to carry wasn't weakness, it was strategy. And it had worked perfectly because she'd understood her family better than they'd ever understood themselves. That evening, I sat in the living room where Margaret and I had spent countless nights, her favorite chair still positioned by the window where she'd read books and watched the neighborhood change over 4 decades. I thought about justice and how it doesn't always look like what we expect, how sometimes the loudest revenge stories are the ones told in courtrooms and lawyers' offices rather than shouted arguments and slammed doors. Margaret had loved me enough to fight a battle I'd promised not to fight, had used her final months to build protection I didn't know I needed, and had trusted that I'd understand her plan even when it felt like the whole world was against me. She'd been right about everything, about her family, about what they'd do, about how silence could carry more power than any words I might have spoken. And sitting there in the house we'd built together, I finally felt the weight I'd been carrying since that hospital conversation lift, replaced by something that felt like peace mixed with the bittersweet ache of missing someone who'd loved me better than I'd known how to recognize while she was alive. 3 days after the reading of the will, I found an envelope tucked inside Margaret's favorite book on the shelf, a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that she'd read so many times the spine was cracked and pages were dog-eared. My name was written on the front in her handwriting, shaky from the illness but still unmistakably hers, and inside was a letter dated 2 weeks before she died. "Oswald," it began, "if you're reading this, then everything happened exactly as I knew it would. They showed you who they really are, and now you know why I did what I did." Her words on that page felt like she was sitting beside me, explaining what I'd been too close to see clearly, how she'd spent our entire marriage watching her family take advantage of my kindness, and her final months making sure it would never happen again. "So I let them believe what they wanted to believe," she wrote. "Because I knew you would understand that sometimes love means protecting someone even from your own family, especially from your own family." The last paragraph of her letter contained the wisdom of a woman who'd spent 40 years learning how to love someone the world kept trying to diminish. The real strength isn't about fighting every battle or proving yourself to people who've already decided not to see your worth, Margaret had written in those final lines that I've read 100 times since. It's about knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, when to push back and when to trust that justice will come in its own time and its own way. She told me she was proud of the man I'd been throughout our marriage. Proud that I'd never let her family's disrespect turn me bitter or small, and that the greatest gift she could give me was the freedom to live whatever years I had left without carrying the weight of people who'd never appreciated what they had. "Sometimes justice isn't loud, Oswald," she finished. "It waits, it watches, and it arrives exactly when it's supposed to, carried by people who loved you enough to plan for your peace even when they knew they wouldn't be there to see it. I still live in the house on Maple Street, still drive past the places where Margaret and I built our life together. And sometimes, I think about how close I came to spending my final years believing the story her family tried to tell about me. But Margaret knew better, saw clearer, and loved deeper than anyone gave her credit for. And because of that, I get to finish my days knowing that the 40 years I gave to our marriage weren't invisible after all. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever stayed quiet while people who should have known better treated you like you didn't matter, I want you to know that silence isn't always weakness, and patience isn't always passive. Sometimes it's the strongest thing you can do, trusting that the people who truly see you will make sure your worth is recognized even when you're not in the room to defend it. Leave a comment below if this story touched something in you, and subscribe for more true stories about finding justice when the world tries to write you out of your own life. Because everyone deserves to be seen. Everyone deserves to be valued. And sometimes the greatest revenge is simply standing up and taking back what was always rightfully yours.